Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next edition of the COVID series on the impact of the COVID pandemic on the sales and marketing function. I am the host, Deva Rangarajan, who is the director of the Center for Professional Selling at Ball State University. As I've gone through a lot of articles that I've looked at impact of different events on salesperson performance, I recently came across an article that is going to be coming up in an academic journal article, which I thought was very relevant given the COVID pandemic. And the title of the article is "Can't Leave It at Home: The Effect of Personal Stress on Burnout and Salesperson Performance." And I immediately caught my attention because that is some of the things that we have right now happening, because salespeople are people are used to traveling and being out on the road, and being constrained and being confined to closed spaces might not be ideal for them. We also see a lot of issues that's got to do with, are they being productive? How are they interacting with people at home? And I thought reading this paper, this was something that could be pretty interesting. It would give us valuable insights. So thank you. We have two members of the team. We have Professor Bryan Hochstein from University of Alabama, who's been on the show before. And we have Professor Michael Peasley from Middle Tennessee State University. Thank you, gentlemen, for taking the time to talk to me and the audience.
Hi, how are you, Deva?
Thanks. And Michael?
Yeah, thanks for having us on. I appreciate it.
Oh, sorry, okay. So now tell me about this. So essentially, can't leave it at home. And you talk about stress and burnout and stuff like that. So what got you started on this topic?
So I'll start with that idea. Really, it's a project of multiple people and just people seeing things in the sales workplace that are changing. We all study change a lot, and we've seen this move towards the sales workplace being more invasive of the home. Yeah. So I worked in sales before becoming a professor, and up until 2012, I worked for Time Warner. And even at that point, I had a home office. We were pretty well connected internet-wise, and really my work life was central to my home life. Okay, so that was, for me, kind of where I'm like, oh, this makes sense, this topic. But others saw it too, saw that there's lots of problems. Yeah, there's this show called Dave Ramsey that talks about financial stress. I think a lot of that ideas came from there, in that people are having financial stress, and it's affecting. Recurring themes in these calls to that show are how this stress is affecting their work life in addition to their personal life. So for me, it was kind of that, as technology now is even further along than when I worked in sales, things like Salesforce, their platform is mobile, pervasive. Managers expect 24/7 attention. We're a global society that has time zones, 24 hours where we're at work normally. Now we're going to talk about COVID, and things are slightly different. But anyways, our research started kind of from that, seeing that sales workplace was always kind of integrated into the personal life of salespeople. It's always been something that we work as salespeople all the time, right? We can work all the time. It might affect things. It gives us autonomy too, so we can be out. It's a good side to it, is that we can be out at kids' sports things, but maybe catch up on work later in the evening or something. But the negative side is what we wanted to discuss and kind of study and see what's going on with it. And now we get to COVID, and here are articles coming out, and it was actually, we were working on it still when this COVID thing hit, and it's just even more relevant now. Now it's not just salespeople. Now it's like the whole world is working at home. So our findings should apply to them as well.
Absolutely. And I think that was what was interesting for me, is that when you did this, sure, you kind of, if for people who are not aware of the academic publishing process, this is not something that you just came up and then did it in a couple of days or a couple of weeks. It's something that's a labor of love, if there's anything at all. And that, my question to Mike is that, to what extent, building up on what Bryan said, so I'm sorry I called you Mike. I hope it's okay if I call you Mike. So Mike, my question to you is that, because of this, because you looked at people taking work home, right? And now, at least in the past, you had a choice. But now you don't have a choice. To what extent do you think that the findings from your work, and we'll get to the exact findings, is even more relevant now, because you can no longer separate work from, you know what I mean? So how do you think that the COVID pandemic is going to maybe have a different impact on your findings? Or is it going to have a different impact on your findings at all?
Yeah, so obviously it would be an assumption, but we're assuming that it would be more pronounced. If you think about people that are working from home now, they have extra personal stress. Especially if their kids are home, they're having to homeschool their children. Maybe that their spouse got laid off, so now the financial stress could be greater. And from a mental health perspective, things could be worse as well. So we're thinking it could be accelerate the process of personal stress impacting their work in a negative way.
Indeed. Yeah, for me, what I really liked about this, and that's pretty much why I want to talk to you about, is that the concept of burnout and stress has been studied in the sales literature in the past. But of course, the context was different, right? The fact is what they're looking at. So essentially, tell us a little bit more about this concept of financial stress, because yes, salespeople are always under financial stress, right? So now how is this becoming more important given the COVID space?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you look at just some of the statistics in our society, about 70% of people live paycheck to paycheck. A lot of people, I think the statistic was 67% of people couldn't even handle a $500 emergency. And most people have less than $1,000 in their savings account. And that was pre-COVID with a really good economy. And so I can't imagine now how those statistics are changing on a daily basis. So financial stress already is something that causes disagreements in the home and just stress thinking about how much you owe. So I think that's definitely going to be more of a problem now.
Indeed. But I think, Bryan, if one of the things you take a look at is this concept of financial stress could actually lead to this concept of burnout, right? So what do you mean by burnout? Is it burnout just, do people just fizzle out, or is it, you know what I mean? Is it something that is progressively, it builds up?
Well, burnout is actually in our world of academics, it's defined by 3 different dimensions, and I'm going to briefly go into those. But one is emotional exhaustion, and then there's a thing called diminished personal accomplishment, and then depersonalization. But the overall concept is that somebody just is less effective is what burnout means, right? They're just less effective at their job or their life or whatever through these 3 different states, being exhausted emotionally, just the term is perfect. I mean, that's what you'd say, right? I'm burned out. I can't go any further, right? And or they start thinking that they can't do things as well as they used to be able to do, or they start just getting really cynical, like nothing's going to work, or other people are against them, or they're just defeated. I think would be the way to say burnout is. And I think this is happening to some extent across most of the people I talk to now. About a month and a half into stay-at-home orders and things. I know I was experiencing this to some extent last week, just kind of overall burned out of just this treadmill we've been on that's been different than normal. I was able to get away, do some different stuff this weekend, and that helped to alleviate those problems. But salespeople, it has been studied in the sales research, and largely, actually almost exclusively, from a workplace stress setting. So there's things like role overload, conflict, things that happen in the workplace can cause these negative burnout elements to occur. The problem with burnout, though, is when somebody experiences it across almost every single study and anything you can think of affects their performance. And that's why we're interested in it, because we want salespeople or any worker to be good at what they do and be able to do it effectively. And burnout affects it negatively. So that's not good.
Indeed. And I think even under normal circumstances, burnout is not good, right? So Mike, my question to you is that from what I hear from what Bryan is saying is that probably burnout is something that does not happen overnight. You have chipping away at your resources and ability to deal with stuff. It leads to emotional exhaustion. And again, once you have that, the worst thing for me is, from what I heard Bryan say from reading your paper as well, is the fact is that this sense of depersonalization and a kind of removing or getting distance away from your customers. And that's essential for a salesperson to be successful in their job with their customers, right? So to what extent do you think that this is something that has long-term repercussions rather than just a short-term repercussion?
Yeah, and that's exactly why a company should care, right? Because if you think about it, in the beginning, you slowly become burned out. You slowly begin this depersonalization process as personal stress is building up. And you may feel a little indifferent about your customers or even callous towards them. Maybe not as customer oriented. So you stop looking out for their best interest, and maybe you care about your financial best interest instead, or you're just indifferent about what their process is. And over time, as customers are supposed to be loyal and hopefully you retain them, some customers are going to begin to deflect, and it's going to impact the bottom line of the organization. And so what could happen in 2 or 3 years is all of a sudden most of those customers decide to go to other places and other companies, and now your bottom line of your company is suffering.
Indeed. I think that's for me, that was what I think was really, really interesting from that perspective, that when I was reading this. And then in your paper, what also caught my attention was this concept of spirals. So Bryan, tell me about this idea is that, yes, in the past, people have looked at burnout as a stepwise approach, but the spiral is a nice way of helping understand this. So Tell us, in the audience, a little bit more about the spiraling effect. Yeah.
So the theory we used had this thing called spirals, and it's simple to understand. As you start going in the wrong direction from burnout, as all these demands keep piling up on you, you just more easily have a death spiral, right? I mean, I'm a pilot. I think of the spin and the spiral down to the earth, which is not a good thing you want to be in. But things start accumulating, and they get bigger and bigger. And we looked at the personal stress we looked at was health stress, relationship, and financial. So it was 3 different aspects, and really all of those are related well to COVID. The idea of health stress fits perfectly. People are concerned about their health and health of their loved ones, significant others, kids, extended family throughout this crisis. But then also the idea of relationship. There's a lot of strained relationships going on right now in homes from people being together more than they're used to, which is seems counterintuitive, but probably is true. Where we kind of have a routine and a system that keeps our relationships going, and that's being disrupted right now. And then the financial, which we've already talked about. So if you start throwing all 3 of those things at a person at the same time, they have some concerns about health for themselves or others. Their relationships are being stressed, and then also their finances. They're laid off. They don't know how they're going to pay their bills. That spiral is pretty hard to get out of, is kind of what the spiral idea is, because there's so many things. And they have work concerns too, which we also study. Everything we look at is over and above existing work concerns. So they have all the pressures they normally have, plus these other things piling on them. And it really becomes, you can see how the spiral becomes really damaging.
And I think for me, the spiral is a great example. No, I should not say a great example because it's saying something negative, but it's something that you have to be really careful about how everything reinforces each other. And the fact is that it's very hard to parse out the specific effects of everything because it's one individual facing all this, right? Essentially, they have the health stress, both for themselves and their family. They have the financial stress. They have the work-related stress. You see what I mean? All of them, you cannot just separate them and compartmentalize them. All of them comes together, and essentially that's for me is what is really interesting from the viewpoint of what COVID is doing, and that's why your paper is so relevant here. But one of the things that you have is, if there's any positive note, I'm sure that your paper is not all bleak, right? You had something about caravans and stuff like that. So Mike, tell me about what do you call caravans, or Brian, you could tell me about caravans and stuff like that. That'd be great.
Right.
I'm going to get it. All right.
Yeah.
I don't exactly understand the term caravan. I don't know if that's a UK looking at going camping.
Yeah.
Or if that is a caravan moving along, but I think it's more like caravan moving along. That part of what we looked at is the positive. How do you get yourself out of this spiral, right? You start accumulating. I look at them as being like small wins, right? That's another way you can look at the caravan. You start getting some small wins and start overcoming some little things, and then some bigger, progressively bigger things. And eventually you start getting some positive momentum, another thing that I study in research, to start building some strength for how you get out of this burnout and and kind of dig out from these events and start coping with them more effectively. So this idea of a caravan is just being able to identify how you could have something positive happen and how that can lead to the next positive thing. And then slowly over time, you can get back to a much less burned out state, which is where we want to be. So the idea in our research is that maybe companies can take a more active role in that with regard to personal stress. So that's why we talked about that.
And I absolutely love the fact is in terms of, so Mike, if I were to ask you, so what role does an organization, I mean, is it just the organization that has a role to play in this, or are there other people also who can actually influence, not influence, help the salesperson cope with these different kinds of stresses?
Yeah, well, obviously the family and the person themselves, there are things they can do, but from an organization standpoint and just from a managerial standpoint, well, there are some key things that we talked about in our implications. One was just simple stuff like health wellness programs, incentives for health wellness, and providing counselors and just anything along the line of mental health and physical health. For relationships, we also talked about not overworking your employees, not expecting so much at home, offering flex time, offering opportunities where the person, that your employee, can go spend time with their family and not create relationship conflict, but hopefully de-escalate any conflict that's there. And then simple financial wellness programs, like Dave Ramsey has a program for businesses. There's a lot of programs out there as well.
I think it's very interesting. You talk about physical health during these times, because that's also very important there as well as a good workout. And actually, this is interesting. You talk about incentives or health plans or those kind of things, because I'm actually beginning to see a lot of companies actually having these group team meetings where they actually discuss yoga. And I saw one very interesting case, not necessarily with salespeople, but actually where the team was practicing yoga, meditation kind of stuff. And this was kind of facilitated by the organization, not it was not made mandatory, but the idea was that apart from a feeling of companionship, you can also voice your frustrations. And I think that is something that you see. I also saw, I guess, in line with this, also these kind of happy hours that people have, forced happy hours, to actually have these kind of conversations, and then the ability to, you know what, yes, I'm still at home, but actually I can sit in my office and kind of reminisce with my colleagues about all the problems that they're facing. And I think now that I see all this and linking it back to your research, maybe these are things that you can actually work on to try to get into a caravan, as you say it. And essentially, when I think of caravans, I think of my reading of all the old Western novels of where you had all the caravans going to the Wild West. So, but the idea is that I can easily see that once momentum comes in, just like you have a downward spiral, you could also have an upward unstoppable force that can also slowly but steadily chip away as well. So, Bryan, and one thing which I also thought was interesting is that I know that you also work a lot on social sales management and stuff like that. One of the things is when you start working from home and you start one of the things I hear a lot about is sales managers now asking their salespeople to become more active on things like LinkedIn, more than what they used to do before. And that goes back to what Mike said earlier. That could be a work stress deliberately created without understanding that it could be creating stress. So tell us a little bit more about this concept of social sales management. It's not specifically mentioned in your paper, but tell us a little bit more about how this could actually also contribute to burnout.
Sure. This is just one thing I had written down for this to talk about today is just, I think we could call this, it isn't business as usual anymore. And social sales management is one of these things that's been creeping into our business world that's made us be more at home or more accessible wherever we are. It doesn't really matter. There's more demands that can be placed on us by our managers. And I think the managers aren't trying to be more demanding. There's just more tools at their disposal today to be able to connect with their staffs, be they salespeople or any kind of worker. We have Slack, we have LinkedIn, we have all kinds of communication channels. We have group chats between people that work in different work teams. We have a lot of ways, and a manager, of course, everything that comes across their desk is very important to them, and they think everybody needs to know it. They want to motivate, and they want to communicate. They want to build knowledge with their sales team. They want to do all of these things, and it used to be we had to have meetings once a month or once a week. Maybe we could send out some emails, but we knew there was some timing issues, and it was difficult to do. But now it can be nonstop, right? So we talk about asking more and expecting more because the technology is there. I mean, I've talked to people just in the last week that, it's great. You'd think you'd be working from home and nobody can meet. We should have a little more time to actually do our job. But because now we've realized that we can do everything via Zoom or other technology platform, people have more meetings on their calendar than they ever did before, because now you don't have drive time. You don't have to wait for people to come at a certain time. You can literally meet 10 or 15 different meetings in a day. You can do that. But there's probably some negative, our research says there's some negative implications from that. So that might be a work stress. You throw into that the personal stress of doing it at home and having kids needing your attention, and lunch to be served, and all of that. So you asked about social sales managing. The concept of that is that managers have more ways to motivate and communicate and build knowledge and do all of that through technology, all of which seems like they're positive in their own world. But then you throw that in with everything else that's happening, and you increase the frequency and expectations, and that can cause some real problems.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that we're seeing happening as well, which is interesting that you talk about this, is that there's heightened expectations of sales managers that the salespeople should be reaching out to more customers, and they're monitoring this as well. And unfortunately, the term monitoring is used negatively, whereas every sales manager that I'm talking to is actually telling them, or at least their idea is that the purpose of doing all this is to take the focus away from just whether you're able to make the sale or not, but actually, are you doing your activity, so that we are working towards giving you the same financial kind of freedom that you're going to earn by not closing the deal, but actually taking care of the customers. But it comes off as being perceived in a different way. So people, it's interesting that they look at it as a way to alleviate your financial stress, saying that you can maybe earn as you should before, but it comes off as being wrong and it adds to your work stress. And I think that was something that I find very, very interesting from the viewpoint of how to take a look at it. So Mike, so if I were to ask you, now that you've done this research together with Bryan and you were to go out there and talk to sales organizations, what would be maybe 2 or 3 things that they absolutely have to nail it down to make sure that they do not lose out on their people, let alone the fact that lose out on customers who might feel that they're not being served well?
Exactly. Well, I think setting realistic expectations for themselves and their organization is really important for each salesperson. So there's got to be some form of boundaries. With people working at home. You've got to understand the expectations that they have with their children, with their spouse. So the most important thing is just to be understanding, set expectations, but set boundaries as well. Make sure they're reasonable expectations, and then have a good plan for, like you mentioned, you want to make sure you're monitoring that your employees are taking care of customers while they're not maybe seeing customers in person. And so having a good plan to track that and make sure customers are not getting lost or not getting served correctly.
Yeah. And I just want to add one more thing. I think personally from what I heard is that, and celebrate successes, right? Because I think I think that's one of the things that's become more important now than ever. And the successes could be on anything, right? Could be if the salesperson chooses to say, hey, I achieved this or I did that, that the idea is to celebrate these small wins, because hey, maybe they can reinforce each other as well. I think that is something that I'm taking away from your work, is the fact is that how can we arrest the spiral and maybe make it into a caravan of moving upward as well.
That's a great point. Yeah, redefine success a little bit. It's not about the sale. There's other ways to define success.
And I think, and because for me, I really believe that you do that, then it has an implication on how you evaluate them and how you're going to reward them, which will then take stress away, but also take stress away from work, make them more committed, and maybe bring them back in. Going back into how we take a look at depersonalization, maybe it brings them back in, and maybe a couple of successes there. And if your financial stress is kind of released, and if they are assured that they will be doing well, it could lead to other kind of, I like the word caravan effect. So essentially that's something that I'm taking away from this. And again, and Bryan, any final thoughts?
Well, I do have one final thought, and I mean, I think you always look for the positive that comes out of any kind of major disruption. And from the very beginning of this, I've thought, what is going to be the innovation that comes out of this? And I'm not sure if it's innovation, but I've been watching sales people. I've been watching the sales world change over the last many years, and the number of technology-based sales enablement tools has skyrocketed. It went from hundreds to thousands to tens of thousands, and the expectations of salespeople to use all these great tools and learn all kinds of new stuff and do all kinds of new stuff has been out there, and it's being ramped up and moving ahead, which is difficult in any setting. Now you throw in a global pandemic, and I think what we're going to do is see people step back and say, well, what can we realistically expect? And what can we learn from this? And what are the negative consequences of some of this stuff? And what's the right balance? So that's true of anything in life. When you find a great new tool, you want to use it as much as you possibly can. And sometimes you find out it creates some pollution later or something, something happens that's negative, the unintended consequence. And we've been seeing that in that social sales management and other research we're working on, and this research, that there are probably a lot of unintended consequences of some really great technology and really great things that are helpful and good, but you use too many of them at the same time and it gets to be too much. So people I'm talking to are really taking a bit of a step back. You're almost forced to take a little breather and say, well, yeah, we could do everything, but is that the right thing to be doing?
Absolutely. So gentlemen, thank you so much for this informative talk. It's been very, very interesting. And again, there's a lot of things that sales organizations, they're facing a lot of issues as well, but they should not neglect the health, the well-being of their salespeople, because it could have implications not only with the salespeople maybe burning out and maybe even turning over and then leaving the organization, but it could also have an impact on your customer relationships as well, which is one of the topics that we had recently discussed about salesperson departure with Professor Huan Wanshi, which is one of the previous issues that we had. So again, thank you, gentlemen, for taking the time. And for the others, again, great insights, and stay tuned for the next topic that we'll be discussing. All right.